So next up is Katie from Friends of the Earth.
Good evening, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here, and thank you very much to Fracking United for inviting Friends of the Earth to speak. I first of all want to touch on why Friends of the Earth has been involved in protecting the right to protest, and why do we care about protest in the context of fracking operations. We care about protest because it is an absolutely fundamental democratic right in any society, and because protest has been a means of articulating and advocating for positive change in society through the centuries, long before that change was ever adopted by the political mainstream. So if you look back, think of things like rights for women, think of the anti-apartheid movement, think of the abolition of slavery, and protest contributed to all of those things. So in the context of a global emergency on climate change, it is extremely concerning that peaceful environmental protest is under threat across the world. You can see this in Colombia with the murder of environmental defenders, but you can see it in this country as well. So, for example, Extinction Rebellion have recently been labelled as domestic extremists by the Policy Exchange Group. You see it also in the state's draconian sentencing of peaceful environmental protesters. So, for example, the Fracking 3 were initially given jail sentences for peaceful protest. Now, Liberty and Friends of the Earth intervened in that sentencing appeal, and the Court of Appeal quashed those sentences because they were manifestly excessive. But the initial response from the state was draconian. So, I now want to touch on how fracking companies have been depressing democratic activities in this country. So we all know that fracking is not popular in this country. In fact, a recent survey undertaken by the government found that just 15% of the public are in favour of it. And yet this government has been pursuing an aggressive pro-fracking agenda. And in the face of opposition from local people, the fracking industry has been calling for seismic regulations intended to safeguard communities to be relaxed. They've also been asking for exploratory drilling to be downgraded to permitted development. And local democracy has been entirely bypassed. So Lancashire County Council, for example, you're probably all familiar with this, rejected Quadrilla's application to frack at Preston New Road, but the Secretary of State saw fit to overturn that decision. So the Westminster government forced fracking on the people of Lancashire. Now, in that context, it comes as no surprise that protest activity is generated, and the response of the fracking industry has been completely disproportionate. They have taken to the civil courts to deal with what are essentially matters of public order, and they have done this by taking out wide-ranging, persons unknown, anti-protest injunctions. And what we view these as is a punitive privatization of public order matters. And I say that because the penalties, if you breach one of these injunctions, is potentially more severe than is available to the state itself under criminal law proceedings for the equivalent criminal offence. In addition, the same safeguards that are in place under the criminal law, such as, for example, the public interest test, are not there with these civil proceedings. Moreover, these injunctions are drafted in broad and ambiguous terms, which has meant that it's very difficult to work out what conduct is actually prohibited and what isn't. So the overall effect is a chilling effect on the exercise of the fundamental democratic right to protest, whether that protest is lawful or not. And these injunctions have been a mechanism to allow companies to effectively buy justice, because there is a serious inequality of arms in terms of the financial resources of one of these multinational corporations as against the resources of local people to resist these injunctions. And moreover, to challenge one of these injunctions risks potentially very severe financial consequences if you lose, because there is no cost protection available. It's also important to recognise that women's rights are being disproportionately affected by these injunctions, because the anti-fracking movement is a movement which has been predominantly led by women, as you would see in this country if you went to Preston New Road. So the third thing I want to talk to you about is an overview of some of the legal challenges that Friends of the Earth has been involved in. We've been involved in resisting all of these injunctions, and there are 5 in place currently across the country in various ways. but specifically we intervened in support of the appeal brought by Joe Corey and Joe Boyd to challenge INEOS's injunction in the Court of Appeal. And that appeal was a fantastic victory for civil liberties. INEOS left court with its injunction in tatters. Entire sections were entirely taken out. Now, we have since then sought to enforce that ruling against Quadrilla's very similarly worded injunction. And very disappointingly, we were prevented from doing so because we were priced out of court. Quadrilla were threatening us with £85,000 worth of costs if we lost. And despite the fact that we were trying to enter these proceedings as a public interest litigant and standing up for the human rights of others, the judge refused to grant us any cost protection whatsoever because these were private litigation proceedings. So, as it is, 3 peaceful environmental protesters have received suspended jail sentences for breaching that injunction. And the injunction remains in place, and that is of grave concern given the increased protest activity which has been generated at Preston New Road following that record-breaking quake that Quadrilla managed to generate a few weeks ago. So in terms of what Friends of the Earth is calling for, we've been advocating for years for an absolute ban on fracking. We see it as completely incompatible with any serious efforts to tackle climate change. And secondly, we also need to ensure that it is possible for citizens to defend the right to protest in court. And at the moment, it's not. The Quadrilla cost ruling makes a mockery of access to justice, and it should be possible for citizens and for civic society organisations to stand up for fundamental freedoms and the rights of others without facing potentially crippling financial costs if they lose. So as a bare minimum, we would advocate that cost protection should be made available as a right in these persons unknown anti-protest injunction cases, because ultimately access to justice is something that should be available for everyone in society. It should not just be for the wealthy, it should not just be for private corporations, and it should not just be for the oil and gas industry. Thank you.